The morning light, filtering through the opulent drapes of the palace, offered no solace. For Maria Anna of Austria, each dawn was a stark reminder of a life not chosen, a destiny etched in her very bones before she drew her first breath. Her trembling hands, the labored rhythm of her breath, the swirling fog in her mind, all were symptoms of a horrifying truth, a truth born of calculated decisions, not of her own failing. Her parents, blinded by an obsession with the purity that defied nature, had woven a genetic noose around her life. Her mother, her cousin, her father, her uncle, her grandmother, also her great-aunt. The family tree, a grotesque sculpture of self-cannibalism, spiraled inward, choking itself in its own coils. She was not a child of love, but a carefully engineered product of a breeding program, designed to preserve power and wealth with a chilling disregard for the human cost. This wasn't a macabre fairy tale, it was the chilling reality for countless women throughout history, trapped in a web of genetic predestination. Before we delve deeper into these forgotten echoes of suffering, the stories that follow are not just historical footnotes. They are visceral accounts of human resilience and tragedy. If the hidden truths of history stir your soul, consider joining this journey into the past. Your curiosity, spanning continents and centuries, connects us all in this shared exploration. To truly grasp the depths of these women's suffering, one must first comprehend the twisted logic that forged their chains. For centuries, European royalty clung to the belief that marrying within their own bloodlines was a divine mandate, a sacred ritual to preserve their right to rule. Their blue blood was not merely a metaphor. They believed it was literally different, purer, touched by God himself. This practice became so ingrained that by the 16th century, European royal houses were less a collection of distinct families and more a sprawling, interconnected web. Cousins married cousins, uncles, married nieces, and even siblings begat children who would one day inherit empires. What they failed to grasp, what their myopic vision of divine right obscured, was the genetic nightmare they were meticulously crafting, a silent horror that would echo through generations. The Habsburg family, rulers of vast swaths of Austria and Spain, perfected this morbid art of self-destruction. It's their unofficial motto: let others wage wars. You, happy Austria, Mary, might have sounded like a romantic decree, but their unions were anything but happy. They were meticulously planned genetic disasters, producing some of history's most profoundly tragic figures. Our first descent into this genetic abyss brings us to Vienna, 1634. In the hushed, shadowed corridors of the Hofburg Palace, a child entered a world already marked by the indelible stain of pain. Maria Anna of Austria, her arrival a somber echo of the Habsburg curse, carried generations of genetic wreckage within her. Her family tree, a cruel mockery of nature, was less a branching lineage and more a tangled knot, a suffocating noose tightening around her nascent life. From her earliest consciousness, Maria Anna was acutely aware of her difference. While other children chased shadows and laughter, her small body wrestled with the simple act of walking. Her spine, a cruel twist of fate, curved unnaturally, forcing her into a perpetual hunch that stole the very air from her lungs. Her jaw, a grotesque caricature, protruded so severely that the simplest act of eating became an exhausting ordeal. Servants with practiced hands and averted gazes meticulously cut her meat into minute fragments, yet even then, each meal was a delicate ballet of cautious chewing and precarious swallowing. But Maria Anna's physical torments, agonizing as they were, paled in comparison to the psychological agony of understanding the source of her suffering. As she grew, she was surrounded by portraits of her ancestors, their painted visages a chilling gallery of her own deformities. Here, an uncle with the familiar jutting jaw. There, a grandmother with the same agonizingly curved spine. With the terrible clarity that only prolonged suffering can bestow, she realized she was not unique. She was merely the latest victim in a long, unbroken lineage of genetic catastrophe. The palace physicians, with their antiquated remedies of bloodletting and their pious pronouncements of God's will, could offer no genuine relief. They whispered in hushed tones about the Habsburg curse amongst themselves, never daring to utter the truth in her presence. To her face, they spoke of mysterious ailments and divine providence, never admitting the unspoken reality that permeated every corner of the court. Her suffering was the direct, undeniable consequence of her parents' and grandparents' relentless obsession with maintaining their so-called pure bloodline. Maria Anna spent her days in dim, curtained rooms, cloaked in a self-imposed twilight, shielded from the world, and in turn, shielding the world from her deformities. Her sharp mind, a precious gift in a body that betrayed her, became her sanctuary. She read voraciously, devouring books that transported her to worlds where bloodlines held no sway, where love, not lineage, dictated unions, and where children were not born bearing the inherited sins of their ancestors in their very bones. But reality, a harsh and unyielding master, always intruded. Court physicians, with their clinical detachment, subjected her to regular examinations, meticulously documenting her deformities. They measured the curve of her spine, the precise protrusion of her jaw, the debilitating weakness in her limbs. She ceased to be a person and became instead a case study, a living, breathing testament to the catastrophic consequences of genetic roulette. The loneliness, perhaps, was a deeper wound than any physical pain. Potential suitors, all of them. Ironically, her own cousins recoiled in undisguised horror at her sight. Marriage negotiations, fleeting promises of a future, would begin with a flicker of hope and swiftly extinguish as her condition became undeniably apparent. She remained unwed, not by choice, but by the cruel hand of circumstance. Even in a world where cousin marriage was the norm, her deformities were too severe, too undeniable to overlook. Maria Anna's brief life ended young. At the tender age of 32, her body, a fragile vessel, battered by generations of genetic assault, finally surrendered. Her death certificate, a bureaucratic formality, listed various ailments, but the true cause, the horrifying truth, remained unspoken. She died because generations of her ancestors chose power over humanity, purity over compassion, and the illusory sheen of blue blood over the very essence of life itself. Her legacy, though tragic, would become a silent testament to the devastating cost of a misguided pursuit of perfection. From the somber confines of Austrian palaces, our narrative shifts to the sun-drenched, yet equally shadowed, court of Spain, where we encounter perhaps the most profoundly tragic figure in this dark tapestry of royal suffering, Joanna of Castile. Forever etched in history as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, born in 1479 to Isabella and Ferdinand, the formidable Catholic monarchs who reshaped Spain, expelling Jews and Muslims and bankrolling Columbus's audacious voyages. Joanna seemed destined for a life of boundless glory. Instead, she became a haunting, cautionary tale, stark monument to the exorbitant price of preserving a pure bloodline. Joanna's madness, the affliction that would define her legacy, was not immediately apparent in her childhood. She possessed a keen intellect, received a thorough education, and conversed fluently in multiple languages. Yet the seeds of her tragic destiny were already sown, embedded deep within her genetic code. Her parents, unknowingly, were cousins, part of the same vast, intricate web of European royalty that had woven itself into a dangerous genetic knot over generations. The first subtle tremors of her unraveling began after her marriage to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy. This union, meticulously orchestrated to forge powerful political alliances, quickly devolved into a psychological battleground. Anne, a man of cold indifference and manipulative charm, was notoriously unfaithful. Joanna's response was an intense, all-consuming love, bordering on obsession, which others, viewing it through the distorted lens of court intrigue, swiftly labeled as madness. But was it truly madness? Or was it the agonizing natural response of a woman ensnared in an impossible, emotionally barren existence? Joanna had been rigorously trained, indoctrinated from birth to believe that marriage was her ultimate calling, that producing heirs was her sacred, inviolable duty. When that very marriage became a relentless fount of humiliation and excruciating emotional pain, her brilliant mind, under the unbearable pressure, fractured. The true descent into her personal hell began with Philip's sudden, unexpected death. In 1506, Joanna's grief, already an oceanic force, transformed into something far darker. Chilling, all-consuming obsession. She adamantly refused to allow his burial, embarking on a macabre odyssey across Spain with his coffin in tow, regularly opening it to kiss his decomposing corpse. This image, horrifying in its starkness, speaks to a deeper, more profound truth about her condition. She had been so profoundly isolated, so starved of genuine human connection throughout her life, that even death could not sever her desperate attachment to the one person who had shown her any attention, however cruel or fleeting. Her father, Ferdinand, and later her son, Charles V, ruthlessly exploited her perceived madness, using it as a convenient and unassailable justification to imprison her. For an agonizing 46 years, Joanna languished in confinement within the royal convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas. The conditions of her imprisonment were deplorable, a testament to the era's brutal understanding of mental anguish. She was kept in dark, frigid rooms, given barely enough food to sustain life, and cruelly denied even basic hygiene, her attendants dutifully reporting on her decline. Described her going weeks without washing, tearing her clothes to shreds, and screaming for hours on end. Her raw despair echoing through the ancient stone walls. Yet here lies the crucial, haunting question. Was Joanna truly mad, or was she systematically driven to madness by the unspeakable cruelty of her circumstances? Modern historians, re-examining the scant evidence, increasingly lean towards the latter, suggesting that her madness was largely a political construct, a convenient and effective excuse to remove a legitimate queen from power. Her behavior, while undeniably extreme, can be understood as the natural, agonizing response of an individual suffering from severe depression, crushing anxiety, profound post-traumatic stress, all exacerbated by decades of brutal isolation and relentless abuse. The undeniable genetic component, however, cannot be dismissed. Joanna's complex family tree reveals clear, disturbing patterns of mental illness, depression, and anxiety, conditions that become increasingly prevalent and devastatingly severe with inbreeding. Great-grandmother had suffered similar debilitating episodes. Her own daughter, Catherine, would later exhibit undeniable signs of severe depression. The pattern, a chilling echo across generations, was starkly clear to anyone willing to see it. To anyone who dared to look beyond the convenient label of madness. Joanna died in 1555, still imprisoned, still officially categorized as mad. Her death, a silent whisper in the grand annals of history, was barely noted. She had been systematically erased from public memory decades earlier, dismissed as an inconvenient madwoman, rather than acknowledged as a profound victim of a system that shamelessly valued political expediency over basic human welfare. Our journey now transports us to the glittering, yet suffocating, golden halls of the Spanish court, where a tiny figure, a little girl named Margaret Theresa, carried the crushing weight of an entire empire in her frail body. Born in 1651, she was the daughter of Philip IV of Spain and his niece Joanna of Austria. Yes, his niece. By this era, the Habsburg family had become a genetic closed circuit, so profoundly inbred that uncles routinely married their brothers' daughters, and such unions were not only accepted, but considered utterly unremarkable. Margaret Theresa's childhood, tragically brief and utterly devoid of agency, is documented in exquisite, almost painful detail through the masterpieces of Diego Velázquez, the court painter to the Spanish kings. In these iconic portraits, we see a child who should be engrossed in the innocent world of dolls, yet she is instead encased in elaborate, restrictive court gowns, her small, delicate face already bearing the unmistakable telltale signs of the accumulating Habsburg genetic damage. Look closely at Velázquez's profound and honest portraits, and you'll perceive what the artist was too diplomatic to overtly emphasize, yet too honest to completely conceal. Margaret. Theresa's jaw, a subtle but undeniable hint, protrudes slightly, just enough to foreshadow the severe deformities that would become agonizingly pronounced with age. Her eyes, often depicted with a distant, almost vacant quality, whisper of developmental delays, of a mind not fully grasping the complexities of her gilded cage. Her posture, even as a mere child, subtly suggests the spinal problems that were a cruel inheritance, a pervasive curse plaguing her entire family line. Yet, the most profound tragedy of Margaret Theresa's brief existence isn't merely her physical condition. It is her absolute devastating lack of agency over her own life. From the moment of her birth, every single decision concerning her future was made by men who saw her not as a living, breathing person, but as a dispensable political pawn. She was promised in marriage to her uncle, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, when she was still a mere toddler. This engagement, a cold, calculated diplomatic triumph, was celebrated across the courts of Europe with no one, not a single soul, pausing to consider the devastating implications for the child at its very center. Margaret Theresa grew up with the chilling, undeniable knowledge that her sole purpose in life was to marry her uncle and relentlessly produce heirs. To ensure the continuation of the Habsburg line, a lineage already poisoned from within. She received the most rigorous and refined education available to women of her era. She mastered several languages, became adept at playing musical instruments, learned to dance with courtly grace, and painted with delicate skill. Yet, all these accomplishments were viewed through a singular, dehumanizing lens. They were merely tools to make her a more attractive, more palatable bride for her uncle's husband. The marriage, a somber pageant of duty, took place in 1666. When Margaret Theresa was just 15 years old, Leopold, at 26, was old enough to be her father, and was, in stark reality, her father's brother. The wedding, a spectacle of elaborate ceremonies and public festivities, was a grand affair. But for Margaret Theresa, it marked the definitive, brutal end of whatever fragile remnants of childhood she had desperately clung to. The raw, physical reality of her marriage, subject hinted at in hushed court records, but never explicitly described, was surely horrific. Margaret Theresa was expected, even demanded, to produce children immediately. Despite her tender age and alarmingly frail health, the pressure was immense, a suffocating weight. The very continuation of the formidable Habsburg dynasty hinged precariously on her ability to bear healthy heirs. She did become pregnant multiple times, each conception a desperate gamble against fate. But the results were almost uniformly tragic. Her first child, a daughter, lived for only a few fleeting months before succumbing. Her second pregnancy ended in a crushing miscarriage. When, finally, she gave birth to a son who miraculously survived infancy, the relief that rippled through the court was palpable, almost dizzying. Yet this fragile hope was short-lived, for it soon became agonizingly clear that the child had inherited the full, devastating spectrum of Habsburg genetic problems. Margaret Theresa herself grew progressively weaker with each agonizing pregnancy. The merciless combination of her inbreeding-related health problems and the relentless physical strain of constant childbearing took an unbearable toll on her already fragile body. She suffered from what modern doctors would instantly recognize as severe anemia, debilitating respiratory problems, and quite possibly epilepsy, a cruel echo of her ancestors' affliction. Court physicians, with their detached clinical precision, meticulously documented her decline. They noted her increasing difficulty with speech, her frequent terrifying seizures, and her inability to keep even the simplest food down. Yet they never, not once, connected these agonizing symptoms to the glaring, obvious cause: the catastrophic genetic damage inflicted by generations of relentless inbreeding. Margaret Theresa died in 1673, mere 6 years after her marriage. At the tragically young age of 21, official records, ever so discreet, listed the cause of death as fever, convenient euphemism. The harsh reality was that her body simply surrendered, overwhelmed by the cumulative weight of genetic defects and the relentless physical trauma of forced childbearing. Her death was mourned throughout the sprawling empire, but not for the right reasons. Courtiers and diplomats lamented the loss of a potential source of heirs, of a political tool, never the profound tragedy of a young woman whose life was mercilessly sacrificed to preserve a bloodline that was by then already poisoned beyond any hope of redemption. Our narrative now shifts to the glittering, yet often superficial court of Versailles where, behind the elaborate ceremonies and magnificent architecture, a Spanish princess named Anna of Austria wrestled with the hidden, insidious costs of her Habsburg heritage. Born in 1601, she was the daughter of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, yet another uncle-niece pairing, a union considered not just normal, but highly desirable among the European royalty, obsessed with consolidating power and bloodlines. Anna's early life in Madrid followed the grim, predictable pattern of royal inbreeding's consequences. As a child, her development was noticeably slow, exhibiting the characteristic learning difficulties that plagued many of her Habsburg descendants. Her jaw protruded in a distinct, noticeable manner, making both speech difficult and the simple act of eating laborious. But perhaps most tragically, she displayed clear signs of what modern medicine would immediately recognize as severe anxiety and debilitating depression, conditions that made her daily existence a constant, exhausting struggle. In 1615, at the tender age of 14, Anna was married to Louis XIII of France, a union part of a complex diplomatic arrangement designed to forge peace between Spain and France, two formidable powers locked in decades of conflict. What no one, it seems, truly considered was the profound psychological impact on Anna herself. She was brutally torn from everything familiar, her language, her customs, her family, and thrust into a foreign court where she was instantly expected to adapt, to blossom, to assume her new, imposing role as queen. The French court, initially, welcomed her with lavish celebrations, but the stark reality of her situation quickly became devastatingly apparent. Louis XIII was a cold, distant husband, displaying little interest in his young wife. He, too, was grappling with his own profound psychological burdens. Modern historians largely agree he suffered from severe depression and possibly struggled with his own homosexuality in an era where such feelings could neither be acknowledged nor acted upon. Anna found herself trapped between two impossible, crushing expectations. As Queen of France, she was relentlessly pressured to produce male heirs to secure the succession. Yet, as a Habsburg, she carried the insidious burden of genetic defects. That made healthy childbearing incredibly difficult, almost impossible. Her first several pregnancies ended in heartbreaking miscarriage or the swift, agonizing death of infants. Each loss, a dagger to her soul, plunged her deeper into the abyss of depression and anxiety. The court physicians, operating under the limited medical understanding of their time, mercilessly blamed Anna for these failures. They subjected her to increasingly painful and humiliating treatments, bloodletting, purging, bizarre and restrictive dietary regimens. They meticulously examined her intimate areas, searching for signs of what they cruelly termed defects in her feminine nature. Not once did anyone consider that the problem might lie in the genetic inheritance she had received from generations of relentlessly intermarried cousins. Anna's isolation deepened with each passing year, as the long shadow of childlessness stretched across her life. She became the constant target of vicious court gossip and relentless political intrigue. Nobles whispered that she was cursed, that God disapproved of the Spanish marriage, had France desperately needed a new queen. The pressure mounted, becoming so intense that Anna began to exhibit signs of what modern medicine would recognize as severe agoraphobia. She became terrified of appearing in public, spending days at a time hidden away in her private apartments, a prisoner within her own gilded cage. Her relationship with Louis XIII, strained from the outset, deteriorated further as both partners, trapped in a cycle of blame, accused each other for their childlessness. They began living essentially separate lives, coming together only when rigid court protocol demanded it. Anna, finding no solace in human connection, retreated into the austere comforts of religion. spending hours in fervent prayer, developing an almost obsessive devotion to Catholic ritual. The miracle, when it finally arrived, seemed almost too good, too improbable to be true. After an agonizing 23 years of marriage, Anna gave birth to a healthy son. The future Louis XIV would become known to history as the Magnificent Sun King. The birth was celebrated throughout France as a clear sign of divine favor. But for Anna, it represented both a profound triumph and a renewed terrifying pressure. She knew with chilling clarity that her primary value lay in her ability to produce heirs. And now, she faced the immense pressure to repeat this extraordinary success. A second son, Felipe, was born 2 years later, finally securing the succession and providing Anna with a measure of relief from the relentless, soul-crushing pressure. But the physical and emotional toll of her long years of suffering could not be undone. Anna remained a deeply anxious, profoundly depressed woman, finding little genuine joy even in her eventual success as a mother. Her later years were marked by increasing physical problems, chronic digestive issues, debilitating respiratory difficulties, and what court doctors vaguely described as melancholy attacks that left her bedridden for days at a time. Modern analysis of her symptoms strongly suggests she suffered from the anxiety disorders and depression that ran rampant in Habsburg bloodlines, conditions exacerbated by the profound trauma of her early, agonizing marriage experiences. Died in 1666. Having outlived her distant husband and witnessed her son ascend to become one of Europe's most powerful monarchs. But her true legacy is not merely the political success that history books often celebrate. It is the profound human cost of a system that shamelessly treated women as mere breeding stock, callously ignoring the devastating genetic consequences of dynastic marriages. While Marie Antoinette is primarily remembered for her pivotal, tragic role in the French Revolution, her story is also inextricably linked to the pervasive Habsburg tradition of inbreeding and its devastating, often hidden consequences. Born in 1755, she was the daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor. This marriage, while not as closely related as some of the more extreme Habsburg unions, still carried the indelible genetic legacy of centuries of continuous cousin marriages. Marie Antoinette arrived in France in 1770 as a vivacious, yet deeply vulnerable, 14-year-old bride, carrying with her not just the monumental hopes of the Austrian-French alliance, but also the insidious hidden burden of her Habsburg genetic inheritance. Her famous portraits by artists like Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun depict a woman of remarkable beauty, yet they also subtly reveal the telltale signs of the family traits: the slightly protruding lower lip, the distinctive Habsburg jawline that had become increasingly pronounced with each successive generation of inbreeding. But Marie Antoinette's deepest struggles, the ones that would ultimately contribute to her downfall, weren't immediately visible. Like many Habsburg descendants, she suffered from what court physicians vaguely described as feminine difficulties: severe menstrual problems, frequent miscarriages, and what modern medicine would recognize as significant hormonal imbalances, highly likely caused by her genetic heritage. Her marriage to the future Louis XVI was troubled from its very beginning, but not in the way that the whispering gossips assumed. Both young individuals were grappling with their own respective genetic inheritances. Louis XVI, by many accounts, exhibited signs of developmental delays and a profound social awkwardness that made intimacy incredibly difficult for him. Meanwhile, Marie Antoinette wrestled with the pervasive anxiety and depression that had plagued Habsburg women for generations. The pressure to produce an heir was immense, a suffocating weight on both their young shoulders. For 7 excruciating years, the marriage remained unconsummated, sparking vicious rumors about both partners, fueling the fires of court intrigue. Court physicians examined Marie Antoinette relentlessly, searching for physical reasons for the couple's inability to conceive. What they failed to grasp was that both partners were dealing with complex, psychological, and likely physical issues stemming directly from their inbred heritage. When Marie Antoinette finally did become pregnant, her difficulties tragically continued. Her first pregnancy was marred by severe morning sickness, crippling anxiety attacks, and what modern doctors would clearly recognize as profound prenatal depression. Her daughter Marie Therese was born healthy, a fleeting moment of joy. But subsequent pregnancies were tragically marked by further miscarriages and agonizing infant deaths, each loss taking a severe, irrecoverable psychological toll on the young queen. The most profound tragedy of Marie Antoinette's story lies in how her genetic inheritance tragically intersected with the escalating political catastrophe of the French Revolution. Her inherent anxiety and depression, almost certainly exacerbated by her inbreeding-related hormonal issues, rendered her ill-equipped to navigate the treacherous, complex political landscape rapidly unfolding around her. Her unfortunate tendency toward impulsive decisions and emotional outbursts, traits that might have been manageable in a stable political environment, became fatal flaws as France spiraled into revolutionary chaos. Court observers, with growing alarm, noted her increasingly erratic behavior as the political situation worsened. She would swing wildly between periods of manic, restless activity and deep, debilitating depression, utterly unable to maintain the consistent political judgment and steady hand that the crisis desperately demanded. Historians continue to debate whether these dramatic mood swings were purely circumstantial, a reaction to the overwhelming stress, or whether they reflected underlying psychiatric conditions common in Habsburg bloodlines. The infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," which she almost certainly never actually uttered, chillingly reflects the way her enemies shrewdly exploited what might have been symptoms of her genetic mental health issues, twisting them to paint her as callous, indifferent, and utterly out of touch with the suffering of her people. Her real tragedy was not callousness, but rather the agonizing opposite. She was utterly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of suffering around her, and tragically lacked the necessary psychological tools to cope effectively. During her brutal imprisonment and subsequent trial, Marie Antoinette displayed remarkable, almost astonishing courage, yet also clear signs of the dissociative episodes that had afflicted other Habsburg women under extreme duress. Guards noted her periods of apparent confusion, her visible difficulty focusing on questions during interrogation, and her tendency to retreat deep within herself when faced with overwhelming pressure. Execution in 1793 marked not just the end of a life, but the brutal, final severing of a genetic line that had, for centuries, profoundly shaped the very course of European history. In her final moments, she reportedly displayed the dignity that had always been her most redeeming trait, but also the profound resignation of someone who had never truly understood why her life had been so relentlessly difficult, why fate had been so relentlessly cruel. Her suffering, a hidden current beneath the grand narratives of power and revolution, is the tragic culmination of centuries of genetic hubris.